For years, fans have wondered how Ned Stark never realized that the man who would destroy him was standing right in front of him all along. Peter Baelish was literally right there the whole time, in the small council chamber, in the brothels of King's Landing, in the private conversations where the fate of the realm was being decided. The most shocking part is that Baelish didn't hide his true identity as a ruthless opportunist. He even told Ned directly, more than once, not to trust him. But somehow, the Lord of Winterfell missed every single warning. The final outcome is well known. In the throne room of the Red Keep, with the gold cloaks surrounding Ned's men, Littlefinger pressed a dagger to his throat and said,
"I did warn you not to trust me."
But it was not a moment of sudden treachery. It was the end of a long chain of breadcrumbs that Ned had seen, dismissed, and failed to follow. The betrayal was not the work of a hidden enemy, but of a predator hiding in plain sight, a man who had been showing Ned exactly who he was from the very first day they met. This matters because Ned Stark was not a fool. He was experienced, principled, and genuinely perceptive about certain kinds of danger, but he arrived in King's Landing carrying a set of assumptions that made him perfectly vulnerable to a man like Baelish. We're breaking down every clue Ned missed one by one, and then you will see that the betrayal was not shocking at all. 1. The trust Ned inherited. Before Ned ever set foot in King's Landing, the foundation of his betrayal had already been laid, and laid by someone he loved and trusted completely. When Catelyn Tully urged Ned to trust Peter, she was handing him a second-hand relationship built on memories that were decades old, and, in crucial ways, deeply mistaken. Catelyn and Peter had grown up together at River Run, where Peter was fostered as a ward of her father, Lord Hoster Tully. To Catelyn, he was the clever, slightly reckless boy who had followed her around as a child. She remembered him with genuine warmth. When she sent Ned a message urging him to trust Baelish in King's Landing, she described him as being like a brother to her. This was the strongest possible endorsement she could give, and Ned took it at face value. But Catelyn's memories were incomplete. She knew that Peter had once challenged Brandon Stark, Ned's older brother, to a duel for her hand, and that Brandon had beaten him badly and spared his life. What she did not fully reckon with was what that duel had meant to Peter. From Baelish's point of view, he had loved Catelyn, fought for her, been humiliated by a Stark, and then watched her marry into the family that had made him feel small and worthless. She remembered a boy who had recovered and moved on, rather than a man who had not. At the time, Ned had no reason to question this. He had never met Baelish before arriving in the capital, and Catelyn's word was the only information he had. But it was also the first link in the chain, because it meant that Ned arrived in King's Landing with his guard already lowered toward the one man who would eventually destroy him. In hindsight, the duel with Brandon was not a resolved rivalry. It was the origin of Peter's deep-seated resentment toward the Stark family, a resentment that, decades later, he would finally be in a position to act on. 2. A man Ned never understood. When Ned took his seat on the small council, he encountered Baelish for the first time in person. What he found was someone who did not fit any of the categories he was used to dealing with. Baelish was not a great lord. He was not a warrior. He was the lord of a minor holding called the Fingers, a small, rocky piece of coastline that gave him his nickname. And he had risen to the position of master of coin through sheer financial cunning and political maneuvering. He was, in Ned's words, a man who had gotten where he was by counting coppers. This was one of Ned's most significant blind spots. Because Baelish was low-born by the standards of the great houses, Ned underestimated him. He saw a useful, if slightly annoying, clerk rather than a dangerous political predator, and his nickname reinforced this impression. Littlefinger was misleading in exactly the way Baelish wanted. He had spent his entire career being underestimated, and had learned to use it as a weapon. The warning sign Ned missed was in Baelish's background itself. He had risen from a minor lordship to the second most powerful administrative position in the realm. He had made himself indispensable to the crown because the crown owed 6 million gold dragons in debt, much of it to the Lannisters, a fact that appalled Ned when he first learned it. Ned viewed this as a failure of Robert's character, not as a sign of Baelish's agenda. He failed to ask the obvious question: who benefited from a crown that was financially dependent on its most powerful noble family? To Ned, however, Baelish was a necessary evil. He knew the city, he knew the court, he had the connections and the local knowledge that Ned did not. So when Catelyn's message arrived, urging Ned to trust him, it gave Ned permission to rely on a man he would otherwise have kept at arm's length, and it meant that Ned never took a close enough look at the man he was relying on. 3. Littlefinger's revelations. When looking at it more closely, what we see is that Baelish's behavior in Ned's presence revealed exactly who he was. He did not hide it. He said it plainly, more than once, in terms that left little room for confusion. So the problem was not that the clues were hidden, it was that Ned mistook them for cynical court humor rather than what they really were. Take a look at this from episode 4. After Baelish helped Ned pursue his investigation into Jon Arryn's death, Ned offered a grudging acknowledgement.
Perhaps I was wrong to distrust you.
Baelish's immediate reply was,
Distrusting me was the wisest thing you've done since you climbed off your horse.
this was a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of a man who knew his victim was too honorable to understand the threat. Ned laughed it off as the self-deprecating wit of a man who enjoyed playing the cynic. There was a second moment, even more explicit this time. Baelish told Ned, "You wear your honor like a suit of armor, Stark. You think it keeps you safe, but all it does is weigh you down and make it hard for you to move." Again, this was not just an observation, it was a tactical assessment. Baelish had identified Ned's greatest weakness, his honor, and he was telling Ned exactly how he planned to exploit it. By being openly cynical about his own trustworthiness, Peter outwitted Ned. Because a man who tells you he cannot be trusted seems more honest than a man who claims to be entirely loyal, and Ned fell for it hook, line, and sinker. 4. The problem trust created. By the time Ned had been in King's Landing for a few weeks, Baelish had made himself indispensable to the investigation into Jon Arryn's murder. He knew which servants had spoken to Arryn in his final weeks. He knew which brothels to visit and which witnesses to speak to. He provided access that Ned could not have secured on his own. The warning sign here was that Baelish was too helpful, and that his help always came with a subtle element of control. When Ned needed to find the servants who had been visited by Jon Arryn before his death, it was Baelish who directed him to them. When Ned needed to locate one of Robert's bastard children, it was Baelish who took him to the right brothel. At every turn, the information Ned received was what Baelish had chosen to give him. This meant that Ned was never actually investigating independently. He was following the path that Baelish set out for him. This led, consistently, toward the Lannisters, toward the secret of Joffrey's parentage, toward a confrontation with Cersei, toward a crisis that would destabilize the realm. In his mind, Ned was uncovering the truth. In Baelish's, he was being guided toward a conflict that Baelish had already calculated would serve his own interests best. To a trusting Ned, this was what it looked like when a man with local knowledge helped a newcomer navigate an unfamiliar city. But Ned never considered that a man could be both helpful and destructive. Peter was firmly in control. 5. Hidden warnings. There was a specific moment during Ned's investigation that should have forced him to reassess everything. It came during the brothel visit in the 5th episode of Season 1. Baelish took Ned to a brothel to see one of Robert's bastard children, an infant girl named Bera, whose dark hair confirmed the pattern Ned was beginning to understand. The visit was useful. It was also deeply revealing about Baelish's methods. This is not just about the location itself. It was what happened immediately after, when Ned and his men were ambushed in the street by Jaime and his guards. An attack that killed several of Ned's men and left Ned himself with a serious leg wound. Baelish was nowhere to be found. He had slipped away before the confrontation began, claiming he would bring the city watch. He did not bring the city watch, he just left. Someone who was genuinely on Ned's side would have stayed. Taken alone, this was a weak signal. Taken together with everything else, it is part of a pattern. On top of this, there was also the Valyrian steel dagger. When Catelyn brought the dagger used in the assassination attempt on Bran to the Eyrie and asked Baelish to identify it, he told her it had once been his, and that he had lost it to Tyrion in a wager during the tournament at King's Landing. Baelish invented the story to point suspicion at the Lannisters and to insert himself into the center of the conspiracy as a helpful informant rather than as a potential suspect. Ned knew about this claim through Catelyn's letter. He accepted it because it fit the narrative he was already building about the Lannisters. But this should have made Ned ask, why was this man so eager to point the finger at the Lannisters, and would he gain from a Stark-Lannister conflict? 6. King's Landing. Ned should have known better. By the middle of his time in King's Landing, Ned had received enough warnings from enough different places. A more politically minded person would have reassessed his position. Varys had warned him, in cryptic but clear terms, that the capital was not what it appeared. Renly Baratheon had urged him to act quickly and decisively. Cersei herself had told him that the Game of Thrones had only two outcomes: you win or you die. The fact that none of them made Ned more suspicious of Baelish specifically is the oversight. He processed each one as a reason to be more careful about the Lannisters, more alert to the dangers of the court in general, but never as a reason to question the one man who was providing him with all of his intelligence and access. If King's Landing was a place where no one could be trusted, why was this guy the exception? The answer was Catelyn's endorsement, and by now it had become a blindfold for poor Ned. Every time he found a reason to be suspicious of the capital, he reinforced his reliance on the one man his wife had vouched for. The more dangerous the environment seemed, the more valuable Baelish's local knowledge appeared. And the more valuable Baelish appeared, the less Ned was willing to examine his motives. 7. The plan and the man Ned chose to trust. When King Robert was mortally wounded, the succession crisis Ned was investigating became existential. Robert was dying. The illegitimate Joffrey was about to be proclaimed king, and Ned had to decide within hours what to do about it. The decisions Ned made in this short time were the most crucial of his time in King's Landing, and they were made in very close consultation with Baelish. When Ned explained that he intended to support Stannis Baratheon's rightful claim to the throne, Baelish immediately argued against it. He proposed instead that Ned rule as regent for Joffrey, maintaining the peace and securing his own position. When Ned refused on grounds of honor and legal right, Baelish shifted to a more pragmatic offer. He would secure the Gold Cloak's loyalty through bribery, ensuring that the City Watch would back Ned when the moment came. Ned agreed. This was important for two reasons. First, that the loyalty of the only military force Ned had in King's Landing had been bought by Peter. Second, Ned had already rejected the one genuine offer of protection he had received. When Renly offered him 100 swords to seize Joffrey and the royal children before Robert died, Ned refused, saying he would not drag frightened children from their beds, an honorable but fatal position. Instead, Ned chose the path that left him entirely dependent on Baelish's word. It's worth noting that Ned had already made another critical mistake to compound everything we've covered so far. He warned Cersei. Before Robert died, knowing what he knew about Joffrey's parentage, he went to the Queen and told her that he knew the truth and that she should take her children and flee. This gave her time as well as the upper hand. He did it because his honor code demanded that he offer mercy before acting. The result, Cersei used the time to consolidate her position, and by the time Robert was dead, she was already several moves ahead. 8. The final warning signs. In the hours just before the betrayal, the warning signs were not subtle anymore. They were direct and almost impossible to misread. But Ned was so committed to his plan, so dependent on Baelish's support, and so focused on the legal and moral rightness of his position that he never stopped to question the very foundation he was standing on. The most significant last-minute clue? Again, it came from the man himself, in a conversation just before Ned entered the throne room. When Ned asked whether the City Watch could be trusted, Peter gave him an answer that was technically accurate and totally misleading. When the Queen proclaims one king and the king's hand proclaims another, whose peace do the Gold Cloaks protect? Who do they follow? The man who pays them. This was not reassurance. It was a description of how the Gold Cloaks actually worked. Baelish explained exactly why they would not be loyal to Ned. Because of course the Lannisters had more gold than anyone. But Ned heard what he wanted to hear, that the bribe had worked. He did not hear it as Baelish explaining one final time that purchased loyalty is not actual loyalty. There was also the matter of Baelish's demeanor in these final hours. He was calm, cooperative, and more helpful than he had been at any previous point. A man genuinely committing treason against a powerful queen would not be this relaxed. A man who had already made his arrangement with the Lannisters and was waiting for the moment to act would be exactly this relaxed. Ned interpreted Baelish's calm as confidence, in yet another misreading of what was actually going on. 9. The betrayal. So we come to the culmination of it all. The throne room scene in episode 7 is the moment when everything became clear. Ned entered with his household guard, expecting the City Watch to back him as he read Robert's will and proclaimed Stannis the rightful heir. Instead, the Gold Cloaks surrounded his men and Janos Slynt gave the order. Ned's guards were killed where they stood. Then Peter pressed a dagger to Ned's throat. What he said in that moment was not even a taunt. It was just factual and heartbreaking. I did warn you not to trust me. He had said so at least twice during their time together. when Ned was beginning to rely on him and again when Ned was fully dependent on him. And now he said it one final time. This recontextualized every previous interaction. The cynical banter was not banter. The helpful access was not help. The brothel visits, the curated intelligence, the advice about the succession crisis, the arrangement with the gold cloaks. All of it had been a single continuous operation, conducted by a man who had decided that the Lord of Winterfell was an obstacle to be removed. The betrayal came because Ned was a Stark, and because destroying a Stark was the completion of something that had begun with Brandon's sword at his throat and Catelyn's rejection in the courtyard of Riverrun decades earlier. Looking back across all of Season 1, the pattern couldn't be clearer. The clues weren't hidden or subtle. They were delivered directly in plain language by the man who would eventually act on them. Ned's downfall came not from stupidity, but from a fatal inability to fully accept that the world being described to him was real. He could hear the warnings, but he could not truly believe in the kind of treachery Peter described to him until he felt the dagger at his throat. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see more deep dives into Game of Thrones.